exchanges tonight. I've been at a lot of these debates, and this is great. Professor Loury, it's your turn. You have a minute and a half to summarize your philosophy of life and then subject yourself to questions.
Well, in 90 seconds, let me get right down to it. A professor of economics lecturing with inputs on the axes says man hours, and a committee of women visit him after the class and instruct him that no, man hours is not acceptable language to quantify the amount of labor that's being used. A class about civics that uses the movie It's a Wonderful Life to illustrate the principles being taught, the film has to be withdrawn because a committee of students visit the professor and instruct him that the black woman in that movie is portrayed in a degrading way. Students are reprimanded or criticized publicly by a university administrator because they organize a theme party organized around the 1950s, and they're told that, well, the 50s was a time of racism, and such a party by students is offensive to others. A professor of law refers to one of his colleagues as, well, he may be black, he may look black, but he thinks white. These examples could be multiplied. The point here is not, of course, that the forces of restriction of thought and expression are carrying people off to dungeons somewhere. The point is that the social pressures and the consequences of engaging in certain kinds of discourse are very severe. Things that can't be talked about on campus today. Is homosexual acts immoral? Can we talk about the extent of differences, overt differences in academic performance between racial groups? Can we discuss whether or not certain affirmative action practices are effective policy for the university? In other words, there are real restrictions on the scope of debate that can take place.
And I just had to restrict you. Does anyone have a question for Professor Loury?
How do you think those restrictions come about?
Well, I think often they're informal. I think in the examples that I just cited, many of them, my own personal experience of people that I know directly, they come about because the academic institutions are influenced by the complaints of students in a way that create cost for people. As I say, no one's dragged away to a dungeon, but one's life is made very much unpleasant if committees of students visits, if deans are called upon, if demonstrations occur outside your office and so forth. As a consequence, it's simply not worth the candle.
Go ahead.
A lot of people...
Go fish. I've always wanted to say that on television.
I still have my question. A lot of people have been made to feel uncomfortable and report it. And I, too, have been made to feel uncomfortable, but I'll keep it quiet. But the people who report it as a wonder. That is, my God, students are talking back to me. That's not the way it's supposed to be. My God, we have these informal pressures, which means that you must remember a time when there were no pressures at all, when there was no sense of what could not be said. Isn't it the case that there's always a sense of what can and cannot be said with impunity, and that what a lot of people are worrying about now is that the game has changed, and what they used to be able to say with impunity they can't say, and what they never expected to hear anybody said is now greeted with cheers and applause. And
no, I don't think that's the case. Indeed, it is, of course, the case that there have always been constraints. I'm certainly not one standing here to say I want to be free to make racist remarks in my classes. What I think is the case, though, is that the cult of sensitivity has evolved in such a way that particular substantive issues of vital importance to be discussed cannot be discussed because particular insular minorities are exercising power, real power, to curtail the discussion that their feelings not be heard. I don't think that helps anybody. I think we have to talk about whether or not a certain kind of affirmative action in a certain place is good or bad for the institution and for the people who are affected by it. I think we do indeed have to talk about the morality of homosexual practices, and to the extent that that's a legitimate subject in a course on ethics or whatever it might be. And those things, as a matter of fact, cannot be freely debated in the climate that I've been describing.
Professor Stimpson.
Well, I have one comment and two questions. First, the comment. There are 3,500 institutions of higher education in the United States, as I said, and my hunch is at 3,500 of them, there is a group of people saying homosexuality is a bad thing, including institutions in this state.
And they're catching hell.
Now my question one, what has happened to courage? I am so tired of these stories of tenured professors with reasonable salaries who meet a group of students who say, please don't do that. And then they go home and whine and cry and say, I am being harassed. That is nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
Some of them even say, I feel I've been raped.
Yes. And then they're held up as these martyrs because a group of students come up and engage them in discourse. And if a professor can't engage in discourse, what is he or she there for? Which leads me. So, what has happened to courage, sir? What has happened to courage?
I think courage is in good stead. I don't doubt that many of us have exhibited it by making the arguments that we've made. But there's something about this charge of racism or sexism. There's something insidious about it that undermines the legitimacy of the person against whom it's leveled, that is taken up by people in such a way as to cast people out of the community. Indeed, the sensitivity mongers ought to understand that the ostracism that attends being cast out of the community because one has been willing to countenance or raise certain questions is a very serious cost to impose on people. No, I'm not saying that we shouldn't express our views or that we shouldn't be willing to enforce them by associating with those whom we like or not associating with those whom we don't. But I am saying that the tolerance that seems to be the mainstay of many of the arguments on the left is not exhibited when people run afoul of certain sacred cows.
Professor Walters.
Let me start this question by making a concession, and that is for the sake of argument. Let's say 75% of the students' complaints are wrong, and only 25% of them are right. Given the fact that they are right, who is responsible then for holding professors accountable? Doesn't it seem strange to you that if 25% of these charges are right, that students have a right to raise these charges? And the fact that they're raising them now in this particular atmosphere, doesn't that signal to you that there is really a very minor system of accountability for professionals in the classroom?
Well, the colleagues of professors hold them accountable for what they say in the classroom by the way in which their work is judged, for what they write in their research and so on.
But they're not the consumers in the classroom.
No, and I will concede that there's nothing wrong with students raising complaints. What I'm saying, though, is that the quality of argument is undermined. This is the proposition that I maintain. Maybe you can rebut it. The quality of argument is undermined. The range of considerations that are brought into debate are limited by the self-censorship that attends the strenuous and sometimes irrational response to certain kinds of positions.
Thank you, Professor Loury. President Botstein, it's your turn. Maestro Botstein, I should say.
I'm afraid the issue isn't freedom of thought. I think the issue is fear. Fear by people who have been active and dominant in university about new traditions. People don't like change, least of all faculty. Faculty have never been known for their courage to speak out. There has never been a high degree of freedom of thought in the university in the way that the critics now accuse us of not having. People didn't speak out against dominant trends 20 or 30 years ago, against fascism in the 30s or during the McCarthy era in the 50s. We don't have high marks for freedom of thought. There's probably more freedom of thought now than there was 30 or 40 years ago. So we're also suffering false nostalgia. People are remembering once upon a time we had standards and a great education. Well, every alumni gathering I come to disproves this. I prefer that they don't believe that they've read Aristotle than the notion they've read it and have so little to show for it. The other issue, of course, is that the university is being held accountable for an intolerance in society which both sides are guilty of. We don't want to listen to the other person. We don't want to be convinced by the other person's language. We don't believe that discourse, discussion is actually going to change someone's mind. And therefore, we only want to be satisfied by symbolic labels. We don't have the language or the educational quality that is able, actually, to conduct dissent. The Supreme Court doesn't want dissent. No one wants dissent. And we suffer that problem in our students and do not know how to teach tolerance and dissent.
Does anyone dissent from that?
Ms. Botstein, why do you find it so difficult to teach dissent since you practice it yourself with such great fluency?
I don't find it difficult. No, I think the issue is that I don't find it difficult. I don't find it difficult, but what I do think is apparent in the university is the kind of self-censorship that Professor Loury talks about is voluntary. It's not imposed by students, by faculty, or by administrators. It is really the lack of desire, a pessimism among current academics, a fear that well, the university was once wonderful, it isn't wonderful anymore. There are new populations coming in. Perhaps they're black, perhaps they're Hispanic, perhaps they're women, perhaps they're the poor who haven't been part of the university before, and they come with new demands. Also, the traditions change. Once upon a time, we taught the Romans. We don't teach the Romans anymore. We teach the ancient classics as essentially Greek. We don't. When was the last college graduate that had to read Livy? They read anything now or Virgil. No, they would read rather Homer. Traditions always change. And aging faculty, pardon the expression, don't like change. So in a way, dissent is very difficult to come by because people are very unwilling to invest in fighting an argument. And also, our culture is not very tolerant of hearing out debates. When was the last time we saw a public discussion? When was the time a student saw a public discussion between two faculty members on any subject in which one faculty member said, you know, you're right, I'm wrong?
Does anyone want to say you're right? Dinesh.
I do want to ask whether you think it is true that there is a culture of forbidden questions, so to speak, among students and faculty in the classroom. When the University of Michigan passed a censorship code, the Office of Affirmative Action issued interpretive guidelines and gave 3 specific examples of violations of this code. I'd like to give you the examples and then ask whether you approve of whether or not students should be prosecuted under them. First, a male student makes a remark in class saying, women just aren't as good in this field as men. Second, you display a Confederate flag on the door of your room in the residence hall. Third, you tell jokes about gay men and lesbians. Fourth, you comment in a derogatory way about sexual orientation or a person's cultural origins or religious beliefs.
And my opinion, of course, is that all should be tolerated. I'm a radical free speech. I have a radical free speech position because I believe the university is a different kind of place. Let me turn the question around. Someone who believes women are, what was the example you gave?
Not as good in a particular field as men.
Or puts a Confederate flag out. I don't want to talk about the Confederate flag in South Carolina, but I'll talk about the women. To turn the question around, we had an exchange student at our place who, in an open class during the Botstein scandal, said, but isn't it true that Jews control Wall Street and Jews are all greedy and capitalists? And I was glad that I could point to the SNL as a WASP form of thievery. But what was interesting is that my attitude, and that should be the attitude of the university, should be to say, come out with more prejudice. Let me hear more. Say all those terrible things, because if we can't correct those terrible things or debate them or illuminate why they might be wrong at age 18 or 19, the whole ball game is lost. That is to say. We have lost sight of the teaching function when we begin to discipline young people for the nonsense they've inherited to the profit of Hollywood, television, popular culture, their parents, and local myths.
Mr.
So what I'm suggesting is that we have to tolerate that kind of speech.
Mr. Silber.
Can you explain or justify why people who know something about the history of the English language and know something about the root meaning of the word man and its application both to men and women would fight so hard to get rid of the notion of chairman or chairwoman, but they would insist on either chairperson or chair, or why they would accept these alterations and brutalizations of the English language as a serious proposition and waste a hell of a lot of time doing so. Is that something consistent with a serious business? You see, I happen to really be concerned about women's rights, and I can't think of a better way of showing contempt for them than through the trivialization of those issues, through those ill-advised linguistic reconstructions.
You and I would disagree.
That's good.
You and I would disagree. It seems to me what you call ill-advised linguistic changes, I think, are a natural and historically documented change in language. What sounds beautiful and elegant to you would have sounded awkward to someone 100 years ago. There are genuine changes in the way we address and speak to people that I don't think we think anymore that calling a black male boy is appropriate. And the reason we don't is, I think, ethically justified. And therefore, the alteration, I may not like it, may come out of my mouth awkwardly, But it seems to me that those kind of alterations are about fostering communication. Why fight a change, even if you think it's ugly? Because it allows you to get to the next step.
Okay, we have to get to the next step. Thank you, President Botstein. Dinesh D'Souza, summarize your book in a minute and a half and save us all $24.95.
There's a comic element in this debate. Maybe it is the case that we should refer to Native Americans as American Indians. Maybe it is the case that pets can only be called animal companions. Maybe it is the case that short people can only be described as the vertically challenged.
I take that hard.
But in a more... But in a more serious vein, at the University of Michigan recently, a student was hauled before a disciplinary committee and accused of making derisive remarks about homosexuality, to which the student pleaded guilty and said he was morally opposed to homosexual conduct. And the university sentenced him to write a forced apology titled "Learned My Lesson," to be published in the campus newspaper, and to attend sensitivity education to transform his unenlightened point of view. This case is not unusual but typical. More than 50% of American colleges now have censorship codes or gag rules on the books which prosecute and punish speech, ideas that are thought to be offensive, that are thought to be politically incorrect. Through university sanctions, universities impose orthodoxy on students.
Thank you. Go ahead, Professor Stimpson.
Mr. D'Souza, why do you persist in not telling the truth? Really, this 50% of codes, I'm going to speak seriously to you now, sir. I come from a university, like many of them. We have freedom of speech. We also have anti-harassment codes, where people are asked not to shut up, not to gag themselves, but simply not to indulge in the kind of speech that would not be protected by the Constitution. And I really wish, because you're an intelligent man and you're a fair man, I really wish you wouldn't exaggerate and misdescribe the situation.
Well, I don't think I do. Most of the harassment codes have traditionally proscribed or forbidden conduct. They have now been amended to add speech, to include the written and the spoken word. And that's the problem, that the harassment codes are being enforced, not in a manner to prosecute hate speech. Anybody who lives on campus, any student, any professor knows there is no epidemic of hundreds of thousands of American students or faculty running around calling each other nigger. That is not the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is that universities talk about equal opportunity, but behind closed doors they practice racial preference, both in student admissions as well as in faculty hiring. University catalogs talk about integration, but in reality we witness enormous racial separatism, a new segregation on campus which is university subsidized. These double standards, these contradictions, are now being talked about by students. This is making the administration nervous.
But I have a question. If I may. Who do you think is responsible for it? How do you think this comes about? Do you really think that this is the imposition of university administrations? Where do you think, if you're right, I'm not sure you are right, but let's assume you're right, that your description is accurate, which I don't think it is. Who's responsible?
Well, I think you have a triangular alliance of student protesters, of faculty activists, many of whose politics were shaped in the late 1960s, and acquiescent administrators. I write in my book that the activists are not the numerical majority on campus, but they are the moral majority. They exercise a kind of moral leverage, and they are very quick to brand any opposition as being tantamount to bigotry. So this is how they are able to rein in discourse.
Professor Walters.
When you put together your recent writings on the question of testing, together with your attack on preferences, the kind of educational institution that you would end up with would be an extremely elitist institution. And I'm really curious to know how you think that kind of an institution would serve the interest and the needs of this country, which is becoming more diverse past the year 2000.
Well, I favor affirmative action based on socioeconomic disadvantage, which I think would benefit poor black and Hispanic kids, but it would also benefit poor white and poor Asian kids. I think racial preference cannot be justified, but if you give a kid a break because he or she comes from a poor family or suffered disadvantage in the past, I think that's a thoroughly American principle of justice.
If you include poor whites as another protected class, and you already have women, don't you understand that you have now most of America included in the so-called affirmative action regime? And wouldn't it be possible then to continue racism and therefore squeeze out the original protected classes for which the law was originally written?
I think one problem is we've seen a kind of proliferation of victim status. When you add up the number of minority groups, as you say, women who comprise 51% of the population are counted as a minority group, you end up with something close to 90% of the population.
Professor Fick.
I would like to give you a chance to correct a misimpression on national television, Dinesh. In a certain page of your book, you have a paragraph which says, first, that in 1960 and 61 at Duke University, they used to teach Shakespeare, Milton, the modern novel, and modern drama. And then the second paragraph starts, but now, and you read from the catalog, courses in gender studies, literary theory, etc. The very firm impression that you give is that those second class of courses have, in fact, driven out the first. But as you well know, in Duke University's experience these days, those first set of courses is still being given with all the vigor that they ever had, and I now give you a chance to acknowledge it.
I don't think that's true. I think in the 1960s, since the 1960s, we've seen a great reduction in the number of courses that are required.
Not at Duke.
This debate is not over what is offered, but what is required.
Duke. You're being inaccurate. Not at Duke. That's all I'm asking you about is Duke.
I'm simply saying...
They pay me. I have to ask the question.
At Duke, as at other colleges, students can read a limited and defined number of texts. If you add new works in, you've got to subtract something from the existing list. So it is a fantasy to assert that no choices have to be made, that if someone comes in, no one gets out.
That's a zero-sum game theory of culture.
All right, on that note, thank you, Mr. D'Souza. Professor Walters. A minute and a half for your philosophy of life, please.
I'm sure there will be. Yeah, that'll be enough. I think that what we are talking about here tonight is the question of the domain of free expression in the academy. And I think that just as in civil society, there are limits to so-called freedom of expression. My colleagues tonight have talked about those limits, and I think have made it quite clear that with respect to disciplinary questions and other kinds of questions, there are certainly limits to free speech and freedom. I think sometimes, given this question of the extended degree to which we want freedom, we forget about responsibility. We forget about the fact that in our Constitution, there is something in the preamble which talks about ensuring domestic tranquility. I think that's still a very laudable aim, not only in society, but also on the university campus. I actually was reading another document when I picked that up, because I'd almost forgotten it. It was the Kerner Commission report on the causes and the prevention of violence. What they sought to do in 1968, in trying to explain how this country burst aflame in violence and how it was so important to develop a new regime of civility, was to go back to this phrase in the Constitution. And I think it's very important, because on our campuses today, many minorities are suffering something which has been called ethno-violence. As a matter of fact, from 800 to 1,000, from 800,000 to 1 million students are suffering this, according to one reputable organization, and something should be done about it.
I have to carve you into silence for a moment. Does anyone have a question for Professor Walters?
Yes, the question that you raised, or the issue you raised earlier, seemed to me a very important one. The increasing number of people who claim special needs on the basis of being minorities, women and others added to this list. That goes right back to the time in the late 60s where the student movement at Berkeley adopted a slogan, "The student as nigger," and used all the techniques that Martin Luther King had carefully developed to advance the cause of civil rights in the name of the most privileged minority that ever existed in this country, namely the American student. supported and paid for by parents, and having so much free time from their studies that they had nothing better to do than to parade around and try to tear up the university. Now, that group of students was treated seriously, but they set a pattern of talking about victimization. And that victimization plea has been picked up by women.
Is there a question coming?
Yes, I want to give you the opportunity of talking further on this issue, because I think you were right on target when you suggested there are people who are claiming protection as suffering minorities that, as a matter of fact, are not deprived at all, but simply are using a gimmick to exclude or to increase the competition for limited resources from those who have been seriously disadvantaged.
Of course, I don't think there's any evidence for that. I certainly can't find it in the history of the 1960s. I think if you go back, I think that that's a relatively proud decade of students challenging authority, and I think those students really were responsible for some of the confidence that students feel now, and some professors feel in bringing many of the professors who have been racist in some of their comments, who have been sexist in some of their comments in classroom, to some sense of accountability.
You don't think that they denigrated the civil rights movement and reduced it to an obscenity in the way in which they tried to suggest that the student, the American privileged student, was somehow a nigger, having been subjected to the kind of abuse that had been directed against blacks in America? You don't see that that is any insult?
I think that's a very isolated incident. I think if you look seriously at the aims of the civil rights movement, it was always not just for blacks. It was always to try to develop a more expansive notion of America that would bring about true democracy. I think with respect to campuses today, we have to return to the ends that students are being educated for. It is not just a question of education, but education for what? Ultimately, if we have a democratic regime on the campus, I think that translates into a democratic society.
Dinesh.
Professor Walters, you speak about an outbreak of ethno-violence. We've heard a lot about racial incidents on campus. If we were witnessing an eruption of the old style of bigotry, it would stand to reason that most of these racial incidents, or a large number, would occur perhaps in the South, places like the University of Mississippi, which had a painful experience with forced integration. We are witnessing these racial incidents at Berkeley, at Stanford, at the University of Michigan, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the colleges that seem most dedicated to multiculturalism, to preferential treatment, to double standards. These are the campuses experiencing the greatest volume of racial tension and racial incidents. So I ask, might it be possible that university remedies, that the universities might be fighting fire with gasoline, and that some of these answers might be exacerbating the original problem?
No, I don't think the geographical solution here holds. In fact, I would point to the fact, yes, just last week, there was an incident on the southern campus. I won't name the campus because you always get in trouble when you do that. But here was the Ku Klux Klan on the campus in the guise of one of the students chasing and beating a black student. It was a Virginia University. It was in the South. It happened just last week.
But
this is no imaginary scenario we're talking about here. There's something that happens. It's real. And quite frankly, I don't think it makes any difference if it happens all over the country. Who is to say that simply because the South has had its particular history that it ought to happen in the South? Fact of the matter is, it's happening all over the country because the suburbanization of the American population, and to some extent the American school, has created a void of information that would dignify minorities in these suburban schools. And so they have become veritable incubators of racism.
Glenn Loury, a brief question.
Ron, let me ask you very quickly about the effect of affirmative action on black students and on black colleges. You're a professor at a historically black college. We know that the number of black students who are scoring on the SATs in the range that would get them into places like Berkeley and Stanford on the merits are relatively small. At the same time, we know that the attrition rate of blacks at some of these elite campuses where affirmative action is practiced is very high. More than half of blacks at Berkeley don't graduate within 5 years, for example. Don't you think that the net effect of affirmative action on historically black colleges and on black students in the way that I've described has been negative?
No.
Why not?
Because the reason, because of historical experience. At the university which you now have come, and of which Dr. Silber is the president, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were taking literally thousands of students from around the country and putting them into special programs. They were doing the same at Brandeis, where I was. And many of these students today are practicing professionals with no post-affirmative action regret syndrome.
Thank you, Professor Walters. A great moment in the debate. Mr. Buckley subjects himself to questioning, rigorous questioning from the opposing team. Who wants to start?